Smith College and a PhD from Columbia University. Her research in intellectual, religious, and gender history focuses in early modern and contemporary Europe, focuses on the medieval Islamic world and also on Islam in early modern and contemporary Europe and the United States. Spellberg is the author of Politics, Gender, and the Islamic Past, The Legacy of Aisha bint Abi Bakr, a widely cited work on the portrayal of Aisha in the Islamic tradition. In 2013, she published Thomas Jefferson's Quran, Islam and the Founders. The book discusses a copy of the Quran owned by Thomas Jefferson as well as Jefferson's views on Islam. She was a recipient of awards such as the Robert A. Hamilton Book Award, the Carnegie Foundation Scholarship, and the CAR Faith and Freedom Award. I should mention that we have a legacy in Virginia with that Quran because our first representative in the House of, in the Congress, who was to be Muslim, was criticized by one of our delegates in Virginia for wanting to use the Quran to be sworn in. Oh, right. And so in a brilliant knock it out of the park, he enlisted the Monticello to share that copy of Jefferson's Quran on which he could be sworn in that politician's own district. So, welcome back to Spellberg.
Thank you, Dr. Susan Douglas, for the invitation and for all of your helpful and patient and wonderful organization of this meeting. Can you hear me?
No.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, great. So thank you. She's been very patient with all the details, and I'm delighted to be here at this wonderful conference. It's always good to be among fellow teachers. This afternoon, what I want to do in part is also, while I'm talking, offer you resources, many of them online, that you can use in the classroom. You may or may not know about some of these, but I am aware, very much aware, that we're all in the hunt for ways to illumine students with primary materials. Sure. Okay, so I want to talk about the important relationship between two founders well known, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, and their relationship to Enlightenment ideals, specifically about Islam. Each man wrote about Islam and its adherents as part of their shared interest in world religions. Jefferson's fascination with the connection between religion and natural rights proved paramount to his role as a nation builder. It contained key precedents for future Muslim citizens of this country. Yet both men, as slave owners, also tackled with the category of race. That was supposed to be tangled, by the way. Only one would emerge as an abolitionist. Did either believe that Islam was practiced in the new country in the 18th century? Did either appreciate how the presence of the earliest American Muslims challenged their Enlightenment ideals of natural rights, religion, and citizenship? In the midst of 21st century debates about who belongs here, both Jefferson and Franklin believed that Muslims did. But the ideal versus the real presence of Muslims complicates this historical picture for each. Thomas Jefferson was a visionary, a man who planned for a nation with Muslims as future citizens, despite simultaneously expressing negative views of Islam. In this seeming bifurcation of his thought, he proved both a man of his time and ahead of it, and something bad is happening there. Let's just get it out. Okay. So, when we locate Jefferson's inclusive views of Muslims, their imagined future American presence, we also identify the pivotal founding precedent that anyone of any religion might reside here with citizenship and equal rights. This is an Enlightenment ideal, which included Muslims, for some. Let us begin by considering what Jefferson knew about Islam, how he learned about it, and some examples of how he used that knowledge politically. In 1765, 11 years before he wrote the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson bought a Quran. What is the evidence? Here it is. This is a note not written in Jefferson's hand, but it comes from the Williamsburg Gazette, Williamsburg, Virginia, which served not just as a newspaper, but also as a bookseller for the time. Now, Jefferson, as you know, was a bibliophile, and he had the money to indulge. So this was a period when he was buying many books that would be ordered in Virginia and shipped to him from England and France. So here we have Thomas Jefferson, Sale's Quran. The author, George Sale, was not the author, but the translator. It says 2 volumes. So this is interesting. It doesn't give the price, but a little further down on the same page, it says that he paid 16 shillings for this copy, slightly under £1. This version of the Quran came to be known as Sale's Quran because the Englishman who translated it was named George Sale. It's important as a book in global history and in Enlightenment history because it's the first translation or version of the Quran, as Muslims would say, that came directly from Arabic into English. And it was first published in 1734 in London. Jefferson bought the 3rd edition because this volume was a sensation in Europe. It was the equivalent of a bestseller in multiple countries, not just England. And it was also, Sale's translation was also the most accurate version of the Quran then available in English. You can note the subtitle, commonly titled The Al-Quran of Muhammad, which suggests a few problems with the perspective of the translator and his Western readers. It had been common for Christians since the first translation of the Quran into Latin in the 12th century to presume that the Quran was not divine revelation from God, but rather the invention of the prophet. This is a standard Christian position on the matter. The prophet was described most often not as a divine messenger, therefore, but as an impostor. So the prevailing Christian notion that Muhammad had invented the verses affected the translation. It was also not uncommon for the 18th century English and American audiences to refer to the Quran as the Al-Quran. You can see it here. For those of you who know Arabic, this means idiotically, but literally, the Quran. Because it fused the Arabic definite article al with the French for Quran. And by the way, technically, having Quran even with a K here was an advance over Al-Quran. They couldn't quite merge it because of common usage. But in the Arabic, Quran starts with a Q, too, not a K, so there's another detail to add. You see here that Sale added a preliminary discourse, and boy was it ever. It was 200 pages long, and it was a wide-ranging explication, not just of the Muslim beliefs, but of ritual practice. There are fold-out maps of the Kaaba. There are fold-out genealogies of the Prophet. It's really quite impressive. The idea behind the translation, however, was not simply academic, although it's loaded with footnotes. This is the era when footnotes become a thing, and Sale has footnotes to his footnotes. And he clearly read in Arabic other texts and commentaries on the Quran. We see that in the footnotes. But in fact, the point of the translation, he was paid by a missionary society of Anglicans who wanted to use the Quran to train missionaries to convert Muslims in the Middle East. How they were going to do that is unclear. They were not powerful enough as a nation at this point to invade anywhere and bring their Bibles, but they were hopeful. Sale, in fact, presented a version of the Quran that was a much better translation, and his preliminary discourse was much more balanced and accurate about the faith itself. So, in fact, he argued against compulsion in conversion. And that's an interesting argument for a Christian paid by a missionary society. But in doing so, he failed to note that the Quran has a verse chapter 2, verse 256, which speaks of there being no compulsion in religion. That's a link he didn't make. But what he did do is advance the idea that non-Muslims should use, quote, common decency in describing the prophet. So although he started with the common calumny, Muhammad may have been imposing a false religion on mankind standard, he then went on to say that the prophet was, quote, richly furnished with natural endowments, beautiful in his person, of a subtle wit, agreeable behavior, showing liberality to the poor, courtesy to everyone, fortitude against his enemies, and above all, a high reverence for the name of God. Sale's preliminary discourse contains some other surprises. Whereas Christian polemic had criticized the prophet's multiple marriages since the 8th century, in contrast to the celibate Jesus, Sale defended polygamy and referred to King David of the Old Testament as precedent. He also argued against most other Christian authors, writing, "They are greatly deceived who imagine it," meaning Islam, "to have been propagated by the sword alone." Indeed, he noted that both Christians in the Crusades and ancient Hebrews practiced a form of warfare endorsed by divine inspiration. And the translator correctly emphasized, quote, that the great doctrine then of the Quran is the unity of God. And he got that right. Jefferson bought the 3rd edition in 1765, but why? At the time, he was a 22-year-old law student studying in Williamsburg, Virginia. He would have been struck by Sale's description of the prophet as the lawgiver of the Arabians. Indeed, Jefferson, influenced by Sale and many others before him, would have been predisposed to view the Quran narrowly as a book of law. Sale, for his part, provided Jefferson with details about the 4 Sunni law schools, and they weren't wrong. But what did Jefferson learn from his Quran and Sale's preliminary discourse on the faith? Jefferson made no marks in the sacred text, except for a terse one, which I'll discuss later. While he took copious notes about other texts he read at this time, he left no explicit reference in them to his Quran. And for a historian, this is sort of devastating, really. But the reason we may not have his notes might be because in 1770, 5 years after he bought the book, he had a fire at his father's plantation where he was living, and he said it destroyed all of his books and all of his papers. I think he said one book survived, we just don't know which one. And this raises a question, and also an intriguing possibility, that he may have bought Sale's Quran a second time, because his copy survives today, as Dr. Douglas pointed out. In fact, it resides down the street, sort of. For this early period of Jefferson's life, from 1765 to 1776, he absorbed problematic information about Islam, not from Sale's introduction to the Quran, or the Quran itself. Instead, he read other prejudiced European books. Of course, it should also be noted that Jefferson's view of organized state religions, whether Christian, Jewish, or Islamic, prompted his severe criticism as a deist, a designation he would share with Benjamin Franklin. In 1765, the year Jefferson bought his Quran, Virginia had an established state religion, Anglican Protestantism, the faith of the Church of England. Baptized into this religion, like the British Quran translator George Sale, Jefferson never formally renounced this part of his identity. At the time, all Protestant citizens of Virginia, whether Anglican or not, were taxed to support this established faith's churches and ministers. All non-Protestants, including Catholics and Jews, and theoretically Muslims, would have been discriminated against not just as non-Protestants, but as non-Anglicans. Jefferson dedicated his legislative energies to ending this prejudicial Anglican establishment of religion in Virginia, because he saw how local Baptists, Presbyterians, Quakers, and others suffered. But we also know that Jefferson envisioned in 1776 what today would be defined as a religiously plural future for his state. By this time, there were some 25,000 Catholics resident in the US and about 2,000 Jews. Both were considered despised minorities among a vast Protestant majority. Evidence for Jefferson's support for what today would be termed religious pluralism appears in legislation he amended in 1776. One example is a bill first titled, "A Bill for the Naturalization of Foreign Protestants." Jefferson changed it to read, "A Bill for the Naturalization of Foreigners," which implicitly included Catholics and Muslims and everyone else. He wrote this at a time when the Protestant American majority, no matter what their denomination, remembered that in Europe Catholics had persecuted Protestants since the 16th century. Catholics in 18th century America remained a potentially disloyal and threatening faith, according to this Protestant majority. Jefferson was a brilliant writer, but he was not a ready debater. And we have his notes on the back of some of this legislation. When he talks about Jews as citizens, he made an argument for their, quote, honesty and veracity, concluding simply, Jews advantageous. So he was in 1776 invested in non-Protestants as future citizens. This was a very unusual position, and it would have been unpopular among most. At this juncture in 1776, a few months after writing the Declaration of Independence, we know that Jefferson returned to Virginia. During this time, he mentions Islam negatively in his legislative debates. Why? In trying to separate the state from all religious matters, Jefferson wrote debate notes that revealed his prejudices about Islam and the Prophet. These ideas were common in Europe, and he reproduced them in his political arguments. In one of Jefferson's Virginia bills designed to put an end to the Anglican Protestant religious monopoly in Virginia, Jefferson declared his state's Protestant establishment to be, quote, an unrighteous compulsion to maintain teachers of what they, non-Anglicans, deemed religious errors. In order to end this monopoly and the discrimination that went with it against Protestants and all non-Protestants, against other Protestants who weren't Anglican and all non-Protestants, Jefferson argued wrongly that the Prophet Muhammad and Islam had denied rational or scientific argument, a potent Enlightenment critique. Where did he get this fallacious assumption? Jefferson's notes indicate that he copied this idea directly from the French philosopher Voltaire. And you all know about Voltaire, I understand, and his novel Candide. So there. So he was also up to, Voltaire was a playwright. He wrote some terrible plays. And one of them was actually about the Prophet Muhammad. And you should not read it because there's no Islamic history in it. But there is a diatribe against religious and political fascination. Fanaticism, it's called fanaticism in French. And it became Muhammad the Impostor in English. But it's an argument against state control of religion and the persecution of others. And it really was about Catholics persecuting Protestants, but of course Islam was the way not to get in trouble. The French censors and clerics realized what he was doing and closed the play after one performance. And the Pope had some nasty things to say about it too. In his other writing, Voltaire wrote in his world history that Muslims only wanted to know what was in the Quran and nothing more. But he knew better. Voltaire owned Sale's Quran just the way Jefferson did. And he also wrote elsewhere that Europeans had borrowed chemistry and many other sciences from the Islamic world, which is actually true. But Jefferson did not absorb these details. He just cribbed Voltaire's prejudiced statement straight off. Jefferson believed, quote, that reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error. A statement in support of rational proofs for religion, another Enlightenment ideal. So when Jefferson asserted that Islam repressed rational argument, a sure sign of error in that faith, he was borrowing a long-held European Christian error of his own. Indeed, Jefferson wanted government out of the religious business entirely. But it's important to note that in referring to Islam, Jefferson never used that word. Neither did almost anyone else at the time. Why? So the vocabulary of 18th century America regarding Islam allows the prophet to be Muhammad, which is pretty close. But Islam, as understood by Europeans, was mostly rendered as Mohammedanism, and Muslims as Mohammedans. And what exactly is the problem with that? You already know, right? Most of you already know that essentially what Christians were trying to do was say that Muslims worship Muhammad, which is not true. Muhammad is a human prophet, and Muslims worship God. So there was that understanding and really a misinformation, a wrong definition of what Muslims believe built into the way they talked about Islam. In 1776, Jefferson abbreviated notes in support of ending this Anglican Protestant religion in Virginia, and they mentioned the prophet and Islam, but not in the terminology we would use. And they're abbreviated. So let's see if we can work through what they mean. So I saw these, and other historians have kind of missed it, but this is the shorthand. It's M something, 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 right? So I take M to be Muhammad, and then forbid, free argument. Then what's this word? The next one. Mohammedanism, for sure. I mean, that's the giveaway, right? And then prevented Reformation. So this is a very Protestant view of religion. He then, what he's trying to say really is that these religions squashed rational and scientific inquiry. And he didn't just go after Muslims. The next section is what? Monkish, right? Impositions, ignorance, darkness, supported on the ruins of inquiry. So those monkish impositions, of course, were shot at Catholics. Who else had monks? And then he concludes that the glorious Reformation of Protestant movement had the effect of shaking off public opinion, whereas in the end, Mohammedanism, supported by stifling free inquiry. Okay, so the Protestants listening in the Virginia House of Delegates would have known right away about the Catholic thing. But the Muslim thing is interesting, in that Protestants often viewed their enemies as twins, and the Catholics and the Muslims were linked, usually. And it's not an accident that sometimes Muslims would have been referred to as Turks in this era too, conflating all Muslims in association with the Ottoman Empire, whose rulers were of Turkish descent. The Ottomans were no longer a threat in the 18th century, but they had done a good job of threatening Vienna a couple of times in 1529 and then again in 1683. And people in England used the Ottomans as a straw man after this to say that the Ottoman ruler was a despot and his people were slaves to his absolute control, and that this was the antithesis of British liberty. So all that was already in the heads of these English Americans, or these early Americans. Even if Jefferson had known or appreciated less prejudicial and distorted views of Islam, they wouldn't have served his political ends as well as the ones that I've shown you. However incorrect, they were politically effective, and Jefferson was a consummate politician. Yet, we would be wrong to think that Jefferson's negative views of Islam during this period of his life interfered with his simultaneous support for the civil rights of future Muslim citizens, because they did not. In 1776, at almost the same time that he wrongly argued that Islam repressed free inquiry, Jefferson took note of the English philosopher John Locke's precedent-setting words about Muslims. Jefferson described Locke, by the way, as a pillar of the Enlightenment, one of his personal trinity of heroes. This is a portrait that hangs at Monticello of Locke. I think it's actually in his bedroom now, which is interesting too. So the other two in, yeah, really, the leg of the line, right? So the other two in the trinity were, who do you think?
Voltaire.
Yeah, that's good. Who else? Who? Voltaire would be a good choice. He went further back. He went actually to the 17th century. He went to Isaac Newton. and Francis Bacon.
Yeah.
So there you go. So Locke in 1689 wrote a letter concerning toleration. And Jefferson was all over that. And we have his handwritten reaction to that text in 1776. And here, I guess there's one, I'll show you where it is. So here what we have in Jefferson's own hand, starting right here, in the fold is apparently he, says, neither pagan nor Mohammedan nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of his religion. This is a completely important and fascinating note that Jefferson took. And we're going to see that if he cribbed from Voltaire, then he also would crib from Locke. And he would do it directly in his legislation. But unlike Locke, Jefferson did not exclude Catholics and atheists from the vision of a religiously plural government. But like Locke, he believed that that people could be property. And this is going to be a problem. Jefferson drew from the Enlightenment Locke, the Englishman Locke, the inclusion of Jews and Muslims, an important ideal which would become an implicit part of his most famous legislation, which you all know, a bill for establishing religious freedom, or the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, as it is called. He seems to have drafted it in 1777 and proposed it as legislation in 1779. It famously asserted, now you see the connection, our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinion. It's a very close paraphrase of Locke. But unlike Locke, Jefferson advocated a form of religious pluralism without Christianity as the state's dominant faith. Jefferson's words set the precedent for the U.S. Constitution's abolition of a religious test, found in Article 6, Section 3, and for the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Jefferson declared that all free, white, male citizens of Virginia should enjoy both religious liberty and political equality. This, Jefferson asserted in his legislation, was a natural right, which he insisted included Muslims. What is the proof of this? 5 years before his death, Jefferson recalled in his autobiography that this legislation that he was so proud of, it's one of the 3 things he requested on his tombstone, had met with opposition while he was away in Paris. And James Madison, his friend and ally, had forced the bill through the legislature in 1785, and it became law in 1786. In his autobiography, Jefferson described some mutilations in the preamble. He recalled his explicitly universal intent when describing a last-ditch effort by Madison and others to resist the insertion of 2 pivotal words. And what were those 2 pivotal words? Jesus Christ. In 1821, Jefferson wrote, and we can see this in his own hand from his autobiography starting right here. The insertion, it should be the insertion meaning of Jesus Christ, was rejected by the great majority in proof that they meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and Mohammedan, the Hindu, and infidel of every denomination. Muslims were part of Jefferson's earliest design for the nation's inclusive ideals. He made theoretical space for them in his legislation, an ideal he embraced from 1776 until the end of his life. It's also worth noting that by the time Jefferson defended Muslims in 1821 as part of an inclusive blueprint for the nation, he had become the first president to prosecute a war against a foreign power, and an Islamic one. 20 years before, in 1801, President Jefferson waged war, an undeclared war, against Tripoli, one of North Africa's powers that sponsored what its enemies described as piracy, but was really corsairing. If you want to know the difference, we can talk about that. It's worth talking about, actually. The so-called Barbary Wars refer to American conflict with Tripoli, Algiers, and Tunis in particular. Morocco was actually the second country in the world to recognize the United States in 1778, just a few months after France. The Moroccans claim it as that they're first, but unfortunately, there seems to have been one country that beat them to it. So when you think about the term Barbary, too, the word comes from the Greek and then the Latin for barbarian. So that's interesting, right? Most American historians don't emphasize that while American merchant vessels had been seized by Muslims in North Africa beginning in 1785, Muslims had been doing this since the 16th century. And they did it with state sponsorship as an economic enterprise because their own economies had been disrupted starting in 1492 and early into the 16th century by the Spanish invading North Africa and establishing their own base there. So in fact, Muslims seized and made captive for ransom and possible freedom, they were supposed to make money off this thing, European Christians floating about in the Eastern Atlantic and Mediterranean. In contrast, Muslims were also captured by Europeans, whether British, French, Spanish, or Portuguese, and these folks were sold into slavery, and usually there was no way to redeem them. This faith-based type of military captivity was not permanent for white American captives, who often complained of their slavery. This is a key Islamic distinction that we could talk about too, between being a prisoner of war and a slave. Upwards of 90% of the Americans who were captured did not succumb to disease or harsh treatment, were eventually ransomed. They often languished for years, but most eventually made it home. But North Africans made a considerable profit out of treaties and ransom. And they attempted to do this with the United States until 1815. In March of 1786, 233 years ago, Jefferson met a Muslim ambassador from Tripoli in London. He and his friend John Adams wanted to talk to this ambassador from Tripoli about a treaty and about the fact that, according to Jefferson and Adams, the United States had never done anything against Tripoli, so why would Tripoli raid American shipping? Adams had met with this envoy before in London, and he, in his letters, his private letters, he talks about how he was received in state, which was a real contrast to Adams, who, as ambassador to the British court, had been snubbed by the king. The ambassador from Tripoli put him in a chair by the fire, and his servants brought him coffee and a pipe that Adams describes as 2 feet long. And Adams had given up smoking, but he said in his letter that he matched the ambassador whiff for whiff. And they talked about different varieties of tobacco, with the Muslim agreeing that the Virginia variety was best. The problem for Adams was that he was no linguist. And so they had to communicate with a few words that he had of French and some Italian. Later, the envoy from Tripoli enlisted a North African Jew to translate the Arabic to English in his conversation. So at a later meeting, Jefferson and Adams met the same ambassador, and they talked about how really the U.S. did not want to have a treaty because the U.S. had done nothing, and so essentially, why pay? But the money was the issue because the U.S. didn't have any. The ambassador from Tripoli, however, was insistent, and he made a statement quoted in Jefferson's letter back to, I think, the Secretary of State. The Tripoli's ambassador said that corsairing or piracy was founded on the laws of the Prophet. It was written in their Quran. Now, it's true that all of the ambassador's assertions could be supported by the Quran, but it's also important that later in the conversation, the Muslim ambassador assured Jefferson and Adams that the Muslims were always successful in capturing others because, quote, the devil assisted his countrymen theologically that's a problem for a Muslim, right? Because the devil who exists as a shaitan is a whisperer who leads people astray. So really what the Muslim envoy was doing is making the best argument he could so that the Americans would pay up. And in fact, he needed that because he himself, the Muslim ambassador, asked for a 10% cut on the amount that he suggested the Americans pay for a treaty. So this is really, it's coercive, but it would be a standard practice. If the ambassador from Tripoli had wished, he could have talked about verses in the Quran that talked about supporting peace and fulfilling terms of treaties, but that wouldn't have got him the money that he was hoping to procure. The problem in 1786 for Jefferson and Adams as negotiators was that the US had yet to have a constitution that could tax its citizens to raise enough money for either treaties or ransom. So they were stuck. As most historians now agree, what moved both parties was not theology, but economics. Indeed, Jefferson, until the end of his life, refused to accept that religion was the prime motive for North African corsairs. But it's probably because of this meeting in 1786 that Jefferson checked his Quran either when he returned from Europe in 1790 or maybe before he launched a war against Tripoli in 1801. This is a surmise because it helps to explain the only mark in Jefferson's Quran. It could be completely random because Jefferson initialed his books at the very beginning or sometimes in between, like in the middle of them. But this is what we have. So at the very bottom here, you can see all the footnotes, by the way, they're beautiful. We have this, what is a T and an I. So T clearly for Thomas, and I as a sort of effete Latin form for Jefferson. So he's using I for J, basically, right? And this is inscribed just below the fourth chapter of the Quran that does talk about fighting for the faith and the rewards therein. You know that this extraordinary book, which is in 2 volumes, is in the Library of Congress. Sometimes it's on display, but if it's not, and maybe they've changed their policy since I've seen it, you can get a library card for the Library of Congress, and you can request this and go to the rare book room, and they will bring it to you. That's what they did for me, and it was an amazing experience. So, you know, there are many displays in the Library of Congress, but this would be one I think students might actually enjoy. In 1806, in the midst of his naval conflict with Tripoli, President Jefferson demonstrated a remarkable empathy for Islamic beliefs. Jefferson's handwriting, which we can see here, this is a draft, he signed it at the bottom. But he was writing to the ruler of Tunis in present-day Tunisia. And he was sending presents back from the United States, which is common. And he said, and with these, meaning presents, my prayers. Yeah, my prayers that God will have you, great and good friend, in his holy keeping. President Jefferson's 1806 peace treaty with Tripoli affirmed in Article 14 the following. As the government of the United States of America has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslimin, meaning Muslim. And you can get this and a bunch of other great early American documents at the Avalon Project online through Yale. Can you imagine this article of a treaty in the United States today being ratified by the Senate? Can you imagine the editorials that would occur if it became the policy of the United States to affirm any of this? And yet this is precisely what happened for Jefferson here. And it's instructive. So it's important to note that this was an era when the United States was not militarily more powerful than North African corsairs. And the question is, when Jefferson wrote to them as his friends and talked about God, the shared God, was it a crafty diplomatic tool designed to impress? Or did Jefferson find in the Quran's idea of an essential Muslim monotheism, an uncompromising monotheism, a view that echoed his own deistic perceptions? By this time, when he was president, he began to study Unitarianism and really embraced it. And so Unitarians, reject the Trinity and assert the essential oneness of God. So there's some personal overlap here. Of course, Jefferson never thought we'd be reading his letters. And the final copy of this one is in the Tunisian archives. There are, however, I have to say, there's a disturbing trend in popular literature of a certain kind to view the Barbary Wars and Jefferson's policy as the beginning of an unbroken arc of violence directed by Islamic powers against this country. Such works are inherently jingoistic, and they ignore the more nuanced diplomatic interactions of 18th century American and Muslim world. So, for example, they would never mention that Jefferson was host to the first Muslim ambassador to come to this country. And in fact, the envoy from Tunis in Tunisia in 1805 came to the White House during Ramadan in 1805, and Jefferson was to have a state dinner for him. It was set at 3:30, and then changed because of Ramadan to just at sunset. So this was Islam employed, right, as a sign of respect. An American senator who was at this dinner from New Hampshire praised the Muslim ambassador's elegant attire, inwrought with gold, he said, elegant and rich. In contrast, the senator described his president's ragged slippers with toes out and hair disheveled. He was not of Jefferson's party, needless to say. Sartorial splendor was on the side of Tunisian, right? All right. Well, let's turn our attention to Benjamin Franklin, who, unlike Jefferson, never met any Muslims that we know of. But he did write about Muslims. Franklin wrote in his autobiography that when the itinerant British evangelist George Whitefield preached to enthralled crowds in Philadelphia, he was obliged to preach in the fields. There was no place big enough to hold people. This happened in 1739, 4 years before Jefferson was born. Franklin remedied the situation by supporting the construction of a new building. He described it, quote, as expressly for the use of any preacher of any religious persuasion who might desire to say something to the people of Philadelphia. Franklin averred that the design of the building would not cater to any particular religious belief. Specifically referencing Islam, he asserted the following: even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send a missionary to preach Mohammedanism to us, he would find a pulpit in his service. Franklin's reference to the chief cleric, the Mufti of the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, indicated that he knew something about the importance of Islamic power and religious organization. Although Franklin's 18th century ecumenical Philadelphia preaching house no longer stands, it is commemorated by a plaque in Philadelphia that you can see. It's stop number 4 at 4th and Arch Streets. While Franklin clearly indicated he intended his new meeting house as a shared space of worship for all, including Muslims, his views about Islam could also be condemnatory. Most of them in this era were, so it's not surprising they percolate into even his thoughts. In his almanac, Poor Richard, of 1741, a copy you can see here, he inserted the following teaser: turn Turk, Tim, who Tim is we don't know, and renounce thy faith in words as well as actions. Is it worse to follow Muhammad than the devil? This would not be a trick question on an exam, because the readers would have known conclusively that turning Turk, meaning converting to Islam, was not something they were going to do. And the equation of Muhammad and the devil was a distinction really from most without a difference. So it was amusing, probably, witty even for some of these readers. But the fact is that there were Americans who converted to Islam in North Africa during the captivity because they presumed the conversion would allow them to gain their freedom, and many did. I have only counted 5 of these, frankly. And those folks did not return to the US, which is interesting. There is some irony in the fact that the very word for Franklin's exceedingly popular almanac, the publication that really made him a rich man, may be derived from an Arabic word, although it's contested. So here we have almanach. Now, you can go to the Oxford English Dictionary and see that it's a contested noun, but it supposedly came out of Spain into English, and it has an Arabic origin. And it may refer to, get this, where a camel kneels down at the end of a day's journey. There's always a camel, you know, in Western views of the East. A reference to both chronology and climate. But Franklin had his own word origin all worked out. It was because of his particular genius. So he said it was all my knack, or all man's knack, instead. In contrast to his defamation of Muhammad in 1741, Franklin elevated the prophet's exemplary behavior on the battlefield 23 years later. In 1764, he published a narrative of the late massacres in Lancaster County, a pamphlet decrying the murder of 20 peaceful Conestoga Native Americans by a group called the Paxton Boys, Scots-Irish vigilantes. These Pennsylvania frontiersmen had done this in apparent revenge for a different Native American raid hundreds of miles away to the west during Pontiac's War. Franklin defined the savage act against friendly Native Americans as a Christian atrocity, asserting that these murdered people, quote, would have been safer, unquote, among Muslims. To prove this, he cited an incident recorded in the life of the prophet, detailing how Muhammad once rebuked Khalid ibn al-Walid, his great general known as the Sword of Allah, for putting to death bound prisoners who had already surrendered. Franklin detailed how the prophet applauded those among Khalid's soldiers who refused to kill their captives at their general's command, and how the prophet said their humanity had impressed him, and the prophet, according to Franklin, said that with great indignation, the prophet excoriated Khalid as a butcher. Franklin applied the prophet's precedent to castigate violent fellow Pennsylvanians, writing this. Okay, so the Native Americans would have been safer if they had submitted to the Turks. We know why he's using that, right? Even though at the time we were talking about the Arabs, but for ever since Muhammad's reproof to Khalid, even the cruel Turks never killed prisoners in cold blood. The cruel Turks thing is also a standard attack from the Ottoman era. And then he says, but our frontier people call themselves Christians. So here, the Muslims do the better thing, inspired by the prophet. And what's really interesting about this for someone who is a historian of Islam and the US is that this reference comes directly from the earliest biography of the prophet that exists by Ibn Hisham. The incident is exactly the same. In fact, the prophet rails against Khalid 3 different times in that account. So I've not found the prophet's biography among Franklin's books, but somehow he had access to this incident, and this is how he used it. He turned it on the Christians who didn't conduct themselves in a way that he found Christian, and he found a positive Muslim example attached to the prophet. Like Jefferson, Franklin visited France and served as ambassador there. As a famed scientist already, Franklin received books about Islam from European intellectuals. One was a Spanish, Latin, Arabic dictionary that a Spanish nobleman sent him. Two others were on Islamic property law, and one was in Arabic, the other in English. Unlike Thomas Jefferson, Franklin didn't own a Quran, but Franklin's final published work, printed in the Federal Gazette on March 23, 1790, offers us an Islamic parody of congressional pro-slavery speeches. The critique, written by Franklin under the pseudonym Historicus, represents the culmination of this founder's evolution from slave owner to ardent supporter of abolition. And we can see here how he changes over time. Franklin was a slave owner. How many slaves, we don't know, but we do know that by 1748, he had several. He then has a will, about a decade later, in which he frees them. By the 1770s, he's beginning to be influenced by local Quakers and even British abolitionists about the matter of slavery and emancipation. In Paris, the center of the Enlightenment and the philosophes, the talk of abolition and freedom for slaves is there. Lafayette, by the way, has a very sort of pointed letter to Jefferson in which he says that the crime of slavery is blacker than the face of any African held in bondage. Jefferson has no response to this, by the way. But so there are figures in France that influence Franklin, and by 1787 he's president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. And ultimately, by 1790, he pens a petition to Congress about emancipation, requesting emancipation. Franklin's final rejection of slavery and support for abolition separates and distinguishes him from Jefferson. Slavery also separates the ambit of both their views of rights for Muslims. Although the two supported the idea of Muslims in America as an ideal, and Jefferson insisted upon their civil rights as future citizens, only Franklin's abolitionist views would have affirmed the legal rights of the earliest Muslims to be granted freedom. Why? Because the first practitioners of Islam in North America arrived here against their will as slaves from West Africa. As one of North America's religions, Islam has a genealogy that stretches as far back as Protestantism into the 17th and even the 16th century. But the first U.S. Naturalization Act of 1790 proclaimed that to become a citizen, one had to be, quote, any alien being a free white person. The earliest Muslims were neither free nor white. However, neither founder seems to have been aware of this fact, nor did Jefferson or Franklin ever connect race and slavery in America to a contemporary Islamic presence. Jefferson at least seems to have theorized that future Muslims would be white, or maybe he just didn't think about it. While Muslims may have toiled on his plantations, they remained invisible to him. Here's the tragic limit to Jefferson's embrace of Muslim rights. His practice of slavery denied real Muslims, already resident in America, both their freedom and any chance at citizenship. Founding ideals of Muslim citizenship founded on the basis of Jefferson's views of racial, not religious equality. Historians estimate that among West African slaves, up to 20% may have been Muslim. By 1776, Muslims of West African origin numbered at least in the thousands, later in the tens of thousands. At the founding of the US, they were more numerous than Jews and possibly Catholics. Before we examine Franklin's final use of Islam as an abolitionist critique of congressional support for slavery, I want to introduce you to two early Muslim Americans. These men, the historian Michael Gomez, who wrote a book called The Black Crescent, described as founders of a different sort, and indeed they are. We know these Muslim slaves because they stood out, as many other Muslims would not want to have done. But these men stood out because they were literate in Arabic, and we have their writing as proof. So here is Omar bin Said, who ran away from his first owner and ended up in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Omar bin Said wrote an autobiography in Arabic in 1831. Although Omar had written an earlier Arabic plea for his freedom, his owners never granted his request because they could not read it. They could look at it, but they didn't know what it said. And in any event, they never freed him. Francis Scott Key of Star Spangled Banner fame heard of Omar and, presuming his conversion to Christianity, see the theme here, gifted him an Arabic Bible. He could get that, but he couldn't give the guy a Quran, right? Omar retained large portions of the Quran from memory, however, and in his autobiography, he reproduced almost an entire chapter. The word for the entire chapter is, it means ownership or possession, mulk. So there was a hidden message in that too, is who owns maybe everyone. Anyway, Omar died the year before the Emancipation Proclamation would have freed him, but a mosque now stands in Fayetteville in his honor. In 1788, Ibrahim Abdurrahman, it's Ibrahim in Arabic, but in the dialect it ends with an A Muslim slave from Senegal arrived in Mississippi, where he would toil 40 years. Due to a confluence of extraordinary circumstances, he did return to West Africa, but without his entire family. Here is a picture of him, an example of his Arabic literacy. At the bottom here, we see in Arabic, his name is Abdurrahman. There's a great biography of him by Terry Alford, and there's a PBS DVD of about an hour now, narrated by Most Deaf, which fits nicely into a classroom period. I actually recommend it. My students like it very much. So, as I said, Abdurrahman gained his freedom, in fact, because the American Colonization Society thought that he had converted to Christianity, and they could send him back to Africa to spread the word. Also, he was so old by this time that he was not, his owner thought that he could part with him. But there are a confluence of circumstances in which it turns out that Abdurrahman, who had always claimed he was of noble descent in Africa, was in fact identified by somebody who had been helped by his father, who was the ruler in Timbo. And so his claim to African royalty was actually understood. And it made a great sensation in the newspapers. He went on a trip with his wife to gain subscriptions, to bring his children with him out of slavery and back to Africa. But all this was to no avail. He actually met John Quincy Adams when he was president, and asked for a subscription. And the president said, no, thank you very much. Delightful. So Abdurrahman recalled that when he was about to take the trip back to Africa, he said, I have left 5 children behind and 8 grandchildren. I feel sad to think of leaving my children behind me. I desire to go back to my own country, but when I think of my children, it hurts my feelings. Forced to write the Lord's Prayer in Arabic to gain donations for the passage back to Africa for some of his family, he instead wrote the Fatiha in Arabic. Yeah, the opening surah of the Quran. So when this missionary was sent back, when he saw the coast of Africa, he resumed Muslim prayer on the ship, on the deck of the ship. But he died within months of his arrival, and he never reached his true homeland. Theoretical citizenship, regardless of religion, an Enlightenment ideal derived from John Locke and promulgated by Thomas Jefferson's legislation, founded in America on the jagged shoals of chattel slavery. Only Benjamin Franklin identified the tragic flaw at the heart of his new nation. His petition to Congress for the abolition of slavery insisted, as Jefferson never did, quote, the blessings of liberty to the people of the United States ought rightfully to be administered without distinction of color to all descriptions of people. Franklin had not only uncovered the contradiction slavery posed to American ideals of individual liberty, He alone insisted on the necessity of removing this inconsistency from the character of the American people. Franklin's petition forced Congress to debate slavery and emancipation as critical issues for the first time. But Franklin's plea for abolition failed. The majority in Congress dismissed it, arguing that as federal representatives they had, quote, no authority to interfere in the regulation of particular states. Franklin opted to place the real Georgia Congressman Jackson's defense of slavery in the mouth of a fictional Muslim named Sidi Mehmed Ibrahim. Sidi is a contraction of Sayyid, and in Arabic that would mean it was an honorific, but also that this man was descended from the Prophet. Congressman Jackson's speeches had personally impugned Franklin, the Quakers, and his petition. So when Franklin wrote this parody, he had personal as well as political stakes in mind. Franklin's Islamic device allowed this invented North African official to rail against an imaginary extreme sect of his Muslim co-religionists who allegedly in 1687 had sought the abolition of piracy and slavery against Christians. Franklin thus denigrated the defense of slavery by American Christians in Congress by defaming them with the same arguments placed in the mouth of a Muslim from Algiers. Algiers, as one of the Barbary Corsairing states, was then a real foreign policy threat to the United States. All Franklin's readers knew that 5 years earlier, in 1785, Algiers had captured 2 American merchant ships and held 21 sailors captive still. And as I said, the raids would continue over the next 2 decades. These captives, these American captives, were deemed slaves by themselves and by other Americans. According to Islamic law, these Americans were not slaves, but prisoners of war, which made them eligible for ransom and eventually freedom. And that's precisely what happened for most. Franklin's parody raised the question, were American Christians the same as Muslims, or worse, with reference to slavery? Franklin's invented Muslim characters' pronouncements reflected the objections of Southern slaveholders to any form of emancipation. Both Jackson and Sidi Mehmed defended slavery for exactly the same reasons. Abolition was a threat to their economic prosperity, financial losses could never be recouped, and former slaves could never coexist as a free people. The Georgia congressman insisted that freedom for slaves would result in, quote, tumults, sedition, and insurrection. Although Franklin's anti-slavery parody skewered both Muslim and Christian practices of slavery, he also unwittingly made the earliest case for the freedom of real American slaves of Islamic ancestry. The extent of Franklin's knowledge of Islam, though flawed, is also on display in this text, which is very short and which is on the website for you if you want to use it. So the way the document starts is Allah, Bismillah, and etc. God is great and Muhammad is his prophet. So there's so many interesting parts of this, but Bismillah means in the name of Allah, meaning God. So Franklin's first phrase was redundant, but correct, in that Muslims started their documents this way, in their official document. His rendering of the Shahada, the Muslim creedal statement, has an error. The first line should be, there is no God but God, instead of, no God but Allah, really, which is the same as God, instead of God is great, which is not really there, but is a nice thing to say, and also Muslims say it. Franklin's attestation of Muhammad as the prophet is spot on. Franklin argued through the invented Muslim Sidi Mehmed Ibrahim that Christians in North Africa could benefit from captivity in, quote, a land where the sun of Islamism gives forth its light as an opportunity for conversion to the true doctrine, unquote. This is one of the rare appearances of the word Islam in the 18th century. It was more common, as you know, to say Mohammedanism. Franklin correctly observed in this text that the Quran permits slavery, but also enjoins masters treat your slaves with kindness in chapter 4, verse 36 of the Quran. His next attribution to the holy book is this, Slaves, serve your masters with cheerfulness and fidelity, but it's inaccurate. There is no such injunction in the Quran. Rather, the quote, and Franklin knew this, came from the Christian Bible. It came from Ephesians 6:5. That says, and here he's really jerking his audience around, right? Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Franklin doubtless inserted this verse deliberately because his opponent, Congressman Jackson, also had invoked the Bible in rejection of Franklin's petition for emancipation. In the supposedly Islamic argument against abolition, Franklin never mentions the numerous verses in the Quran that enjoin the manumission of slaves. Of course, this wouldn't have helped his Islamic parody because it was supposed to be the essence of the anti-abolition congressman. But Franklin never knew, maybe, that there were other verses that talk about manumitting slaves as righteousness in the Quran and as an expiation for sins. The liberation of a slave is an expiation for sins. And there are multiple verses of this. Finally, Franklin never recognized that white American captives in North Africa did not suffer lifelong enslavement, as did black slaves of West African origin. As captives of war, as I said before, most white captives were redeemed from their North African captivity. Franklin's comparison equated white American slaves detained by Muslims with black West African slaves held in the United States. For Franklin, finally, both were inimical, I can't say it, wait a minute. Sorry. Both were inimical. I can't do it. You say it for me. Yes, that's what they were, to his concept of individual freedom. Must be later in this lecture. Anyway, Franklin's invocation of Islam ran the gamut, as did Jefferson's, reflecting a range of American views of the faith. The diffusion of European Enlightenment ideals about reason and rights, and slavery and abolition and Islam impacted both Jefferson and Franklin. Their views reveal considerable curiosity and some real understanding about the Muslim faith. Even in the midst of actual conflict with Islamic powers, Jefferson and Franklin rank among a distinguished minority of founders who imagined Muslims as future citizens of their new country. Only Franklin, however, not only identified the glaring inconsistency of slavery at the heart of his country's founding true principles of liberty, he also surpassed Jefferson in his attempt to legally eradicate it. Franklin's Islamic salvo against slavery and for emancipation would be published in the Federal Gazette on March 23, 1790, only a few days before his death. It would be his final published work. And this is a reference to an article I did for the Pennsylvania Historical Society. It's 9 pages long. If you just plug in my name or Benjamin Franklin in Islam, it comes up on Google. I think it says you have to access it through JSTOR. But you can get the original of all his papers, including this final text at franklinpapers.org. I've posted the document also on this website. And if you want this article, all you need to do is write to me and I will send you a PDF of it. The rights of Muslims in early American history were once debated only in principle. For a religious population, both Jefferson and Franklin seem not to equate with West Africans already in the country. Of the original triad of religious outsiders in the US that once included Catholics and Jews, Muslims alone now remain the most constant objects of a seemingly unceasing defamatory public discourse. Our founding history can help students understand our shared complex national history and Islam's important and enduring place in it. Enlightenment ideals of civil rights, regardless of religion or race, have been challenging for this country. Yet the 21st century election of American Muslims to Congress provides the hope that precedents about universal rights may indeed be more than theoretical. So, as Susan mentioned, our first congressman, Keith Ellison from Minnesota, won his election in 2006, and here is swearing on Jefferson's Quran in 2 volumes. It's important also to emphasize that this is his private ceremony, that using a holy book of any kind is optional and up to the individual elected, because first, the only oath or affirmation that a federally elected person needs to take is to what? Which he had already done, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, Debbie Wasserman Schultz had decided that she was going to swear on the Hebrew Bible and not the New Testament because she's a Jew. So this is not exactly the first time, but you're right. Virgil Good, as Dr. Douglas pointed out, from Virginia, Good, interesting name, he said that this was basically the end of American civilization. Essentially, you can look it up, I mean, the rhetoric is quite, and then, of course, the Quran turns out to be Jefferson's. There was a second Muslim congressman from Indiana elected, Andre Carson, who's still in office. And as we know more recently, Rashida Tlaib from Michigan and Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. Rashida Tlaib is supposed to have thought about using Jefferson's Quran, but in the end, both women used family Qurans for their private swearing-in ceremony. So these are pictures that Jefferson would have understood in some part, but would have blown his mind. And I think that's a good thing, by the way. So thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Douglas had to step out for just a minute and just ask me to open the floor to questions, please.
Sure. Hi.
I just have a question, and it involves Thomas Jefferson's Quran. Because about a year ago, there was an article that was released about it, and I wanted to hear your interpretation. I'll just get to the main idea.
Sure.
I guess some historians, and I find this very interesting, I was doing some reading, viewed Thomas Jefferson's Quran, that the purpose of it, even though he did do reading and research on Islam,
Yeah.
but some of them, I've heard an article that said, well, no, it's actually a symbolism of oppression, white oppression, because, and let me explain, and I know
White oppression.
yeah, let me explain this.
Okay.
This historical perspective. I wanted to hear your thoughts on this. They were saying, or let me rephrase that, on whites oppressing other groups. Let me clarify my statement. Because they were saying that the reason Jefferson was studying the Quran was so that finances could be sent out to, because he, of course, in his administration, did send finances to propagate missionary work in his administration, and that was the reason. And so there were articles about how certain people were offended that Jefferson's Quran was being used, because they said even though he had a Quran, his intent wasn't to study it, it was to use it to quote unquote force conversions. So I would like to know your perspective on that, because I read
I would
an
love to
article
see,
about
I would love for you to send me the article.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of this depends on who wrote it
Okay, I'm just
and
curious.
what their evidence is in terms of
because there
missionizing.
was a lot said.
I bet there was. Well, you know, chronology is one way to answer this.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1765, at like 21, he was a law student, and he wanted to know about world religion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we could have a talk about, I think, and the missionizing, it seems to me, although this is not my area of expertise, would have been directed to Native Americans, potentially, during his time in office. There's no evidence I've read that he intended to missionize Muslims anywhere.
Okay.
And if you think about it, if you think about Jefferson, his idea of religion, and this remote God, and the oneness of God that he shared with Muslims, I'm not at all sure that Jefferson as missionary fits with the picture of him drafting that Virginia statute legislation, which gets religion out of state control. Why would he use his office to impose religion, Christianity or anything else, on anyone else? I really don't see it. I don't see it connected to the Quran. I do see it for, potentially, for Sale the translator. right? Because there is a missionary organization, the Anglicans of England, who paid them for the translation. And their goal was to convert, was how they were going to do it, it's a little fuzzy. But Jefferson didn't buy it for that reason. He was buying books on law at the time, and he was a law student. So even before he gets entangled in the North African thing, which is 40 years later, basically, his intent to read the Quran was to learn more about the religion, but about Islamic law, I think, actually. And I don't think his idea was to use it for missionaries. I don't see that at all. I think it sounds like a very poorly sourced historical. But I'd love to see it.
Okay, I'll see what
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Well, but this speaks to that people get very upset that he owned the Quran, so they have to dismiss it in some way. Right? There can't be any positive aspect to this regarding the content and the religious nature
the
of the
thing
Quran.
is, though, and this is what I thought was interesting when I read that article.
Sure.
It was actually, and I'll see if I can find it,
Mhm.
it was actually some people who were Muslim that criticized it. Because they said that the intention of him using that Quran was not the intent.
Yeah.
And because, Jefferson was, very, well, when you look at him in history, he typically was very contradictory in a lot of his actions. He would say one thing in some cases and do another. So that was the thing, that whole article was intent.
Was intent to mission.
Was his intent. That's what it was, and that's why I wanted to ask.
But it's to
you about
convert
it, because it was-
Muslims?
Well, it's
Convert
just,
who?
yeah, Muslims. That's what, and again, that's the reason I asked, because when I read the article, it seemed very unusual.
Yeah.
Strange, that's the reason I'm asking. I was reading that and I'm like,
I appreciate
so I wanted to
that.
hear if you had heard anything about that.
So this, somewhere online.
I'll see if I can forward it.
Yeah, unfortunately, you can find a lot of things online. And this is true about Jefferson's Quran, right? So the reason I talked about the Barbary War so much is because there are people who have TV audiences who have authored books about his conflict in North Africa that are Jefferson's first war on terror, right? So you see where we're going with that, right? It's not just a history, it's bad history, really bad. Because there are nuances in this era. And none of that is effective if we're making an argument that says Muslims have been our enemies since the 18th century. And that's where those books should be ranked. So I'm curious about this, so thank you.
You're welcome.
I appreciate that. Sir?
Yeah, were there, I would say, establishment figures who did see, it sounds like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson did not see in their own country African Muslims.
Right.
Did anyone, is there evidence of any, I mean, obviously the African Muslims saw, but I mean, are there evidence of folks who wrote that down, who wrote down the presence of African Muslims were they visible to power structures? Were there responses to that? Perhaps, whatever, fear, trying to, stop organizing or whatever.
It's a good question. I mean, I do think if we look at the case of Abdurrahman, one of the things that happened is he became famous because a local newspaper editor met a white guy who had been taken captive in Africa and actually knew both Abdurrahman and his father when he was there. And the newspaper story spread, and as a result, the US government, hearing that there was this African person, decided that he must be from Morocco. Because as a Muslim, he must,
That's where,
West Africa didn't compute with Islam that way.
Uh-huh.
So they, even when he was touring before he took the ship back to Africa, Abdurrahman, they dressed him with a turban and they made this outlandish outfit for him. But in fact, they tried to use him as a diplomatic tool with Morocco. The government said they would send him to Morocco on their dime, because in that case, that would set up a precedent for the return of Americans who might be stranded there. So there's that. I mean, I think the whole question, I just mentioned two Muslims who were literate in Arabic, but Alan Austin has a book that catalogs, I think, upwards of 20 men who came to be known to the people around them usually because of their literacy in Arabic. And in foreign policy, it looks like, Abdurrahman never, when they finally told the president that he wasn't Moroccan, they couldn't exactly say you have to stay a slave, but they were not happy. The government was not happy. So in terms of elites noticing Muslim slaves generally, no. But the thing is, the people who owned these literate Muslims, it was a blessing and a curse, right? So as a slave, regarding religion, you didn't want to be open in your practice of anything that wasn't Christianity. So it was dangerous for Muslims to be out this way. So in fact, there are probably many more Muslims who have been trained in these Quran schools in West Africa who were literate but did not want to draw attention to themselves for fear of worse treatment and punishment. And to me, actually, the question of, it's a very interesting question, when we see one literate Muslim, the presumption is not that there are more. There's not a hunt to find more Muslims. There's just a sort of ham-handed attempt to use them diplomatically and wrongly because they have such a limited vision of where West African slaves come from and their faiths in their indigenous country. But this also begs the question of where are the Muslim slave women? And I personally am very interested in this. It would have been much more dangerous for Muslim women to demonstrate, right? They were already vulnerable to sexual predation and all kinds of other hideous things. But what I have found is that George Washington owned two slaves named Fatimer, Fatimer. Fatimer and Little Fatimer, which suggests the mother and the daughter. I'm presuming Fatima because it's the name of the prophet's daughter means they're Muslim. Names don't always give us what we want because slave names were erased and things. But this isn't a one-off. Actually, what's interesting is that there's an article that says that there may have been as many as 5 Muslim slaves at Mount Vernon. But Washington, at his death, freed his slaves, right? And the truth is that I found other Fatimas in plantation sale records. I found a bunch of them. Now, whether they were literate or not, we don't know. But it's not inconceivable, right? Yeah.
Right, so I have a question about the Spaniards. Did the Spaniards prohibit the importation of Muslim slaves to the New World? Because I've seen things about that, and can you talk to us to why they did that? And then also, I've also heard that Muslim slaves were much more likely to rise up against and incite slave rebellions against their owners. And can you speak to why is that, and if that has anything to do with the Muslim tradition?
Sorry, what was the last part?
And why were they more likely?
Well, you can read a book by Sylviane Diouf, D-I-O-U-F, Servants of Allah, in which she sort of makes that argument. The fact is that the majority of slaves who crossed the Atlantic ended up in the Caribbean and Latin America. And although there were a couple of slave rebellions in North America, the majority were in the Caribbean, and particularly there was a huge one in Brazil at the turn of the 19th century, early 19th century. And among those who rose up in places like Trinidad and Jamaica and Haiti, there were Muslims. So Michael Gomez talks about this in Black Crescent. Sylviane Diouf actually says that because Muslims already came from West Africa and had an ethos of jihad against others who were Muslim and non-Muslims already, that they had a sort of warrior mentality, and they would rise up and not want to. I mean, I think it really kind of is a disservice to other slaves to suggest that only Muslims had the idea that maybe this was a bad way to live and they should rebel. And in fact, that's not the case. Muslims and non-Muslims joined in these rebellions. It's true. Now, it's also true that because of the way the slave trade worked, that probably within a first generation, people from the same tribe, because there are linguistic differences among Muslims, there are tribal differences, there's a history of conflict. So once people landed and sort of made common commerce with each other, there had to be a kind of density point of people who would agree, who could talk about this and understand each other. So that is part of it. But the argument is out there that Muslims were, inherently, because some of them had been warriors in West Africa, more likely to rebel. And we see there's a rebellion in Bahia, Brazil, where there are all kinds of amulets written in Arabic to protect people who were rising up. But it's also true that there were non-Muslims in that uprising. And so, I think it's possible that Muslims made good organizers of uprisings, but there were other risings that didn't include Muslims, so there's that. And as for the Spanish, that's an interesting question because there shouldn't have been any Muslims in their territories anywhere. Not in Mexico, not in Colombia, and yet we have transcripts from the 16th century of about 100 people who were accused of being Muslim and brought to trial by the Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition went after Jews in the same places, but the claim that people were Muslim is interesting because there were successive laws passed that, even on Columbus's ship, the argument is made that former Muslims, maybe not practicing, but of Muslim descent, and even Jewish descent, were in his crew. And they were the first people. I mean, you'll find some people writing on Muslim heritage that also a Muslim embassy, a Muslim ship from West Africa, from one of the kingdoms there in 1450, attempted and successfully crossed the Atlantic. There's not proof they made it to the other side. There is proof there was an expedition, right? So there's some attempt by West African Muslims to claim pride place in that. The Spanish wanted to prohibit Jews, the spread of Judaism or Islam in their new territories. So they said, if you are a descendant of Jewish or Muslim persuasion, and of course Spain was controlled by Muslims politically from 711 to 1492, there were considerable populations of still practicing Muslims there through the 17th century. But the Spanish were bad about policing this. And that's what those court cases seem to suggest, that people actually made it through the barrier nonetheless. And in fact, if you want a good case for your students, I teach in Texas, the exploration by the Spanish known as Cabeza de Vaca, right? What's his other name is? He has a Spanish name, but the assumption is that this fellow was originally Muslim and probably from North Africa. Yeah, no, and he explored not only Texas, but
I think it's Mustafa. His name is Mustafa.
I'm not sure if it's Arabic. The Spanish gave him a name too. I'm trying to remember what it was. But that expedition ended up being led by him as far west, I think, as New Mexico, and then into Spain, where he was killed by Native Americans. So, and that's 16th century, right? So because the Mediterranean was so fluid with Muslims and Christians and shipping being attacked by each side, all kinds of people were transferred across the Christian-Muslim cultural divide there. So of course some of them ended up in Spain. And whether they were overtly or covertly practicing, there were Islamic presences. And during the Depression, the WPA did interview folks. The last slave ships came to places like Georgia and South Carolina because Muslims were, from certain areas, were prized because they knew how to cultivate rice and indigo. And so there were interviews with people who had family recollections of Ramadan, of certain prayers,